Hello, survivors. So I wanted to make a video today about how narcissists and codependents are similar. Because I think when we identify our similarities with another, we have greater understanding about where they're coming from, as well as greater compassion. So one of the things that is similar between codependents and narcissists is that they're both codependent. The traditional definition of a codependent, or how it originated, was through Alcoholics Anonymous, and the codependent was the enabling partner, and they were considered codependent. There's a little bit of variety and difference about how that's looked at today in the terms. In some ways, codependency means dependency on another to satisfy your needs, your wants, your outward seeking of validation and need for confirmation, need for what the self should provide. So in that way, both narcissists and codependents are technically codependent, but they have different responses to trauma. And the codependents usually fall into the fawn category, and the narcissists usually fall into the fight category. And it doesn't mean that it's like 100% one or the other. It's black and white. It's not black and white, rather. It's dominant traits or not. But in narcissistic personality disorder, their typical response is to fight. They are identifying with the punishing parent. I believe that they are borderlines underneath. But so there's a lot going on. But I wanted to just focus on how codependents and narcissists are similar. If we look at needing an outside source to confirm us or to validate us, both codependents and narcissists need that. The narcissist is looking for supply. They're looking for attention. They're looking for a fawning audience. They're looking for someone to confirm how great they are, how much they're admired, how much they're a wonderful person, how golden they are. That's what the mirror is. That's what the narcissist, the Narcissus myth, the narcissistic supply is essentially that emotional investment by another, and they feed off of that. The codependent, on the other hand, wants validation and wants acceptance. And so they're codependent because they're always looking outside themselves for confirmation, for validation, for saying that they're okay. They're looking for that acceptance. So in that way, both narcissists and codependents are dependent upon outside sources for things that they could be providing to themselves. It's not to say that everyone doesn't enjoy a certain amount of validation from the outside, or a certain amount of emotional affirmation, or just normal interaction. It's just that when you do that exclusively, or when you do that in excess, or when that is more of the percentage of where you get your self-identity from, rather than confirming that for yourself, that's when it becomes problematic. And that's actually where the narcissist and the codependent are equally separated from reality. Because if you are always needing, and actually I see it as two sides of the same coin, in the sense that if you are always needing the other person to confirm your reality, I guess it was in the talk between Sam Vaknin and Richard Grannon, where they said that narcissists are reality denying and codependents are reality seeking, but they both need the other one to kind of be on board to help them do that. So the narcissist wants to get the codependent to believe their version of reality. And whether it's real or not doesn't matter. It's just whatever they believe, whatever they're putting forth. They don't want to acknowledge the broken, hurt, borderline underneath. So they want the codependent to support their aggrandized, grandiose version of themselves in reality. It's like being that audience to that false self. The codependent, on the other hand, is reality seeking. So they're wanting the narcissist to confirm that they're okay, that they're accepted, that they are part of the group, part of the golden club that the narcissist puts forth. So the narcissist puts forth a version of reality that may not be real, that more, as we know, more often than not is not real, that's based on their ego. And the codependent surrenders to that because they are looking for someone who is confident and determined and offering them that completion of self, that validation of self, what's missing in themselves. They're looking for that acceptance, validation externally. So in that way, they're similar. They're both codependent in terms of needing the other person to fulfill and give them that sense of grounding, and that's in the way that they are two sides of the same coin. But the narcissist, a way that they're different, is that the narcissist they don't want equality, they don't want connection. They want reinforcement of their views, reinforcement of their beliefs. So they want the codependent to come along on board and reaffirm, sort of be their mirror, essentially, their narcissistic supply, and reaffirm their version of reality, be their audience, be their mirror, be their source of emotional sustenance. And the codependent gets fulfilled by fawning and pleasing and giving. Essentially, it's going to be the narcissist taking and the codependent giving. And they're comfortable with that because they're roles that have been ingrained in them as responses to likely childhood trauma. So the narcissist abandons the self, throws up a false self, and the codependent also abandons the self, but adheres to the narcissist self as a way to gain acceptance, be safe, search for that trauma. It's kind of like a response to the parent that they were fawning towards as well. So it's an attempt to fix that damaged relationship with the parent where there is no room or acknowledgement of the self for the codependent. So they are trying to use the narcissist as sort of like the de facto parent or the proxy parent that things were broken with. So, or they still get to avoid the self because that's a conditioned, ingrained, internalized response. And they get to have the narcissist fulfill that missing piece. So another way that they're similar, the narcissist and the codependent, is that they both project. And this is a losing battle for the codependent. This is a losing bargain for the codependent, because what the narcissist will do is that they will project their broken, hated self onto the codependent. And the codependent will project the caring, giving, enabling, empathic self onto the narcissist. So I call it kind of like the old switcheroo, where the narcissist thinks that the codependent is a worse person than they are. They want to blame them. They want to project the bad parts of themselves onto the codependent so that they can relieve themselves of the pain of the recognition of that being part of themselves. So if the problem is externalized, then it's all on the codependent. it's all over there. The problem is outside of themselves. The codependent, on the other hand, projects all this loving, empathic, giving onto the narcissist. So essentially, they think the narcissist is a better person than they are. They think they project the loving, empathic, giving qualities of themselves onto the narcissist. And so it's like this two-way mirror where the narcissist sees the bad person that they believe themselves to be in the other person. And the codependent sees the loving, compassionate, giving, empathic version of themselves in the narcissist. So it's like this mirror that kind of bounces off. So they're actually doing the same thing. That's actually how they are two sides of the same coin. Eventually, the codependent may recognize when reality doesn't match what is being the projected reality enough, there becomes enough dissonance where the codependent starts to question what's going on and why doesn't the story match my experience? Why doesn't the story match what I'm receiving, the information I'm receiving from my senses, from what I'm seeing? And at that point, the codependent may wake up and realize that the narcissist is not the false fantasy version of the self that they project themselves to be. They may recognize the projection and they may see behind the mask. I mean, I know in my case, I still felt like I loved the broken little boy behind that, but it's not necessarily a two-way street. It's not necessarily that you can see the false self and be very in love with that. And then you can also see the broken, self-rejecting borderline under that. And you can love both of those. It's a codependent's nature to be empathic, caring, compassionate, wanting to fix that person, wanting to help that person. But it's not necessarily the same action in both directions. The narcissist doesn't necessarily, they're terrified of weakness. They're terrified of vulnerability. They don't want that. So for them, if they see you as weak, it's almost like they have to reject that because they reject that about themselves. If they see you as broken, it won't elicit a sense of compassion. It will elicit a sense of almost bullying or punishing or antagonizing, fighting, essentially, because they're not identifying with you as a separate being that is worthy of compassion. They're identifying with themselves as someone who is not worthy of compassion, not worthy of empathy, not worthy of any of that kind of consideration. So they're essentially punished. It's really not personal. Essentially, they're punishing themselves and what is weak and vulnerable in themselves by projecting that onto you. So both the codependent and the narcissist project. They just project in different ways. They project their own reality onto the other. And the reason it becomes so imbalanced and so skewed, and the reason that the codependent suffers from this, is because the narcissist projects the rejected self onto the codependent, and the codependent projects the empathic, compassionate, giving side onto the narcissist. So these two people who are really who they are, one thinks that the other one is better and one thinks the other one is worse. The narcissist thinks the codependent is worse than they are. The codependent thinks the narcissist is better than they are. So it's like a skewed reality for both of them. Neither of them is connected with reality. Neither of them sees that they're both, both have strengths and weaknesses. Neither of them see that they are both complete and although flawed beings. It's not real. It's almost like an exaggeration, interestingly enough. Each of them provides a mirror to the other, which is an exaggeration of each of themselves. So the codependent sees an exaggerated version of themselves in the narcissist, and the narcissist sees an exaggerated version of themselves in the codependent. One is seeing the other person as better, and one is seeing the other person as worse. And it's really a reflection of the narcissist's self-abandonment, self-hate, self-rejection that they project onto the codependent. So the two similarities so far are that they're both codependent. They both rely upon outside sources for information, for validation, for emotional sustenance, and they both project. So the way out of that for the codependent is to have self-sustenance, not depend upon others to make the self okay, to validate the self-validation instead, and to stop projecting. So don't project onto the narcissist that they're this loving, compassionate being. Once that mask slips and the codependent kind of wakes up to the fact that they are not this projection, then often there's a lot of hatred and vilification, and it's still misunderstanding. It's in some ways projecting something onto them and saying, why aren't you this person that I believe you to be? Even if they're contributing to the fantasy, even if they're showing themselves to be a certain person, I think that the codependent wants them, wants to believe in the fantasy. And so does the narcissist. But they're both kind of guilty of believing in the false self that the narcissist throws up. The thing is that the narcissist is committed to it. The narcissist has the false self as part of their identity. The codependent believes in the false self because they want to again self-avoid and surrender to the narcissist. So when they realize that this is a false self, when this isn't real, there can be a lot of disappointment, a lot of disappointment in the self for believing in such a thing. That's where the despair and the sadness and the disappointment of the codependent comes about when the separation happens, or when the codependent realizes they've kind of been believing in all this false nonsense, BS. But the difference is that the narcissist really believes it. They're invested. They have to maintain it to be okay. The codependent will sometimes want to shoot that false image full of holes because they've come to recognize that it's false. But that is very scary and very damaging and very for the narcissist, their whole being is focused on maintaining this false image. It is their safety net. It is their default. So when the codependent tries to hold the narcissist accountable or show them as false, reveal that false self, I think of the Wizard of Oz, when, if Dorothy or any of the other characters point out that the guy is behind the curtain and not this, wise Oz, the narcissist has a lot more invested in that. Their identity hinges on that. Whereas the codependent, they have a similar emotional investment in the sense that their avoidance of themselves is very pronounced, and they have real emotion. They've invested in this real belief, they've sort of poured themselves into it emotionally, but you can't match the level of self-abandonment, self-refusal, self-rejection, and the commitment to the false narrative, the false truth, false self that the narcissist has constructed. Because for them to acknowledge themselves is not an option. it's not an option. So if you're going to get into that battle, be prepared to lose, because that's not something that the narcissists will be comfortable with. That is not something they will tolerate. They will put all the heat back on you. And so that's a way that narcissists and codependents are similar, in a few ways that they're different. Essentially, they're two sides of the same coin. And that's why, as in Ross Rosenberg's book, The Human Magnet Syndrome, they find each other because one's the leader and one's the follower. One is self-aggrandizing and one is self-abandoning. So through that, it's very attractive. It's magnetic. It is familiar. It is all the things that draw two people together. But when you realize your own part in it, you can heal from that. You can make different choices. You can recognize in what ways you're similar and in what ways you're different. And by changing that, you allow yourself more options. So that's just a video on the similarities between narcissists and codependents. Thanks again so much for watching. Stay healthy, stay safe, and stay sane. Thanks for watching.